Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 6, and I believe we're on Part 4, talking about humans and the environment. So, with environmental change and the things that we've been talking about, so let's just real quick go back to the last slide, right? Looking at, say, the land use changes in Colombia. These are things that we can observe through various ways. Today, we could observe ground use changes by satellites. We could actually look at the ground use pictures and see what type of land is being used for farming or for forestry. Going before we had satellites, we can look at old aerial photography, we can look at land records, how much acreage was owned by farmers. But one thing that needs to be done is this idea of ground truthing. So take the example, you know, of looking at that in Colombia. We are looking at the larger picture, right? The societal change that drove hunter-gatherers to the margins, and this rise in farming and this rise in cattle for grazing, right? Ground truthing would go in and go to those actual hunter-gatherer tribes and see how were they coping with this loss of land. What were their processes? How did their society react? The finer grained processes, the vulnerabilities they faced. In other words, the things that you might not get from the air. It's a different scale of analysis. Okay. And it also makes us aware of locational bias. And here's a great example. All of these green dots represent weather mapping stations. So if you notice, the United States is quite green, right? Most of Europe, India, but large parts of northern Africa have almost no weather station maps. So does that mean that weather doesn't happen there or it's not important? No, that's because this is the Sahara Desert and not a lot of people live there. So not as much. But look at right here between India and Pakistan. And you might say, well, maybe there's more of a government funding of weather stations, right? Different priorities, different ways societies want to measure things. And so you can see that evident in this map. But that also means that if you are studying weather patterns, then you have to be aware that there is a bias for data from North America or Europe or India, right? And that the data coming from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia is inherently of a different scale. In other words, the bias of where you actually do your ground truthing. When they look at studies of environmental action and political ecology, which we'll talk about next, inevitably there's a heavy bias towards the United States and Western Europe because most of the scholarly work that we read in academia and in higher education is done in universities in the United States and Western Europe. It's easy sometimes to study your own backyard, if you will. Okay? But that leads to this idea of political ecology, one of the terms I had you look up. And what is this, right? And it's quite simply this. How land is used isn't just a matter of what makes the most sense. It's often this complex relationship between who has the power to make these decisions, who profits from the use, and usually power is not equally shared. Unequal power relationship. So a great example the book talks about was this study of soil erosion, of farming practices that lead to soil erosion, which leads to less crops in the years forward. And it was more about poverty amongst farmers and marginalization than it was actual farming practices or population. And why is that the case? Well, if you're a poor farmer and you need to make every last dime you can from your fields, you might farm a little bit more intensively and risk greater soil erosion in the hopes that you get more money and more food. Whereas if you have a little bit more of a safety net, maybe you don't farm this field that year or you don't plant quite as many plants. So in other words, unequal power. If you have more power, which in this case would mean more money, more food, then you don't have to subject your field to as much usage. And that's what political ecology is about. Think about famines and food deserts. And as we said, famines never occur because of a shortage of food. It's the human interactions and the distribution of food that causes it, right? Food deserts occur in the United States. We have no shortage of food in this country, but what we do have is a shortage of distribution that occurs in neighborhoods that don't have the same political or economic power, right? And then the last thing we'll cover is global climate change. And oftentimes you'll hear uh, global warming, climate change kind of tied together. The proper term, if you want to be really specific, is climate change, of which the main component is warming of the globe. And this is caused primarily, there's many features, but at the end of the day, when we do the science, the biggest one single cause is fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels like oil and gas and coal to power our world. And by burning those fuels, we release gases that are making the earth warmer. There are other things, but that is the one major difference. It's also important to note, as we mentioned before, that the effects of these fossil fuel usages vary widely. So remember I showed you that map that the people that produce the most carbon are not going to be the ones to suffer most from climate change? So if you think about the United States, Chicago is a large source of pollution with factories and cars. You have a lot of pollution, but the wind blows it south to the Great Smoky Mountains in the Carolinas, where it causes acid rain in the national forest, right? So the effects vary. And the United States has this ability to kind of cover for that, right? We can build cars that burn cleaner. We can spend more money to clean our skies. But some countries don't have this ability, right? And so some countries and some households face what they call the double exposure, increased vulnerabilities we're going to talk about a little bit later in this semester. Um, I think about this example with the COVID epidemic, right? We were told that the best way to not get sick was to remain socially distant. If you can work from home and work remotely, like I'm doing right now, that's great. If you can have your groceries delivered, that's great. But what about the people who can't work remotely? What about the people whose jobs depend on being in a store or in a shop? A, their shop was closed and they weren't making any money and they were in serious trouble. Or B, they had to go to the grocery store or the store to work and interact with people every day, right? So people who had more resources faced less exposure. And so a lot of areas face this double whammy. Economic and political changes also accompanied with environmental aspects. So at the end of the day, when we look at the landscape, the environments around us, we have to realize that A, they are a combination of not only the physical environment, the forests, the trees, the lakes, but it's also cultural and natural. And they have deeper meanings that are political or economic or social significance. So I am going to talk about map twins in Chicago. These two people both live on Ashland Avenue with the exact same address. One lives at 6700 Ashland Avenue, and the other one lives at 67 Ashland Avenue. The difference is, one lives at 6700 South Ashland Avenue and 6700 North Ashland Avenue. And so they got together and meet and talk about the differences and the similarities in their lifestyles. This is a live link which will take you to this artist project, and I've included it in your materials. It's a fascinating read. They talk about this. If you look at these two houses, right? If you take away the N or the S, it's 6500 Wolcott. Can you tell me which one is north and which one is south? And every time I ask this in class, the vast majority of students get it right. And so what does that mean? That means this landscape is created politically, economically, it has social significance. These two map twins found that when they came to visit, I'm going to ask you this right now without me telling you, which one do you think lived on the north side and which one do you think lived on the south side? I will tell you this, we'll get back to that. When they went to visit the person on the north side, they both discovered that within walking distance of that north side resident's house, there were many places to go for a cup of coffee, plenty of stores to look at. Not the same answer for the person on the south side. They had to get into a car to drive for someplace to go have a coffee or go shopping. And that's also part of the landscape. Your neighborhood, the where you live. Think about where you live. Can you walk easily? Can you walk safely? Is it clean? Do you have parks? Right? And so this is all part of your environment around you. It's not just, the trees and the grass and the leaves. It's the houses and the sidewalks and the parks and the vacant lots. So if you want to find out who lived in which neighborhood, go to that link again right here. It's a fascinating study. Really neat. But the other thing to notice is that because we create these landscapes, right? They can also be contested. People can change these. They can resist these. They can resist. If A neighborhood has people coming in that they don't want to come in. And this was often the case in the 1950s and 60s with equal rights and the civil rights movements. Neighborhoods that were all white, as African Americans began to move in, that was definitely contested and resisted. Eventually, many of the white residents left and moved to other neighborhoods or other cities. Today, oftentimes you will see neighborhoods work to either maybe ask for a store to come in, or they protest the pollution in their neighborhood. The Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago has had some really severe issues with environmental degradation. There was a former electricity plant, a coal burning plant, that was being demolished, and the demolition created a lot of environmental hazards, dusts, and dangerous chemicals. And that has definitely been resisted. And at the end of the day, they also tell us who has power, right? If you drive through a neighborhood of very, very wealthy looking homes, and think about what makes a home look wealthy, do you think they have more power? Do you think the person who lives on North Walcott has more power than the person on South Walcott? Because power is often tied to many things: politics, but also economics, race, ethnicity. And so neighborhoods tell us that too. Right? If you're in a neighborhood where the houses are, half the houses are broken in or boarded up, the storefronts are closed, there's empty lots, that tells you that neighborhood has very little power, doesn't it? That projects that image quite clearly. But if you go to a neighborhood with big, huge mansions and shiny new stores and beautiful parks, that tells you something else. And so all of this goes back to this idea of absolute versus relative space. Okay, it talks about making this location north or south, good or bad, rich or poor, white or black. So that's kind of the difference. I'm going to pause right here because I've got some dinner in the oven. I got to take it out, and then when we come back, we'll finish up the chapter.